He stopped breathing the moment he saw them, because the 4 children standing across the street looked exactly like him. But a stronger hook. What would you do if 4 strangers looked at you, and one of them softly called you Dad? Daniel Whitmore had built his life on certainty, control, and precision. Every decision measured, every risk calculated, every outcome predicted, but nothing in his 39 years. Not the boardroom battles, not the billion-dollar deals, not even the quiet loneliness of his penthouse overlooking Central Park, had prepared him for what he saw that late afternoon on a crowded Manhattan street. Traffic hummed. Taxis honked. People rushed past with coffee cups and phone calls. Yet the world seemed to fall completely silent as his eyes locked onto 4 children standing near a crosswalk about 20 feet away, 3 boys and a girl, all between the ages of 6 and 10, dressed simply. Nothing remarkable at first glance except for one impossible detail. They had his eyes, the same sharp jawline, the same dark hair, even the same subtle crease on the left cheek when they frowned, and right now, they were all staring directly at him as if they recognized him. Daniel felt a strange pressure in his chest, not pain, not fear, but something deeper, something unfamiliar, like his entire reality had just shifted half an inch off center. He took a slow step forward, convincing himself it was coincidence, genetics playing tricks, the human brain searching for patterns where none existed. But then the smallest of the 4, a little girl clutching a worn backpack, tilted her head and whispered something to the boy beside her. And the boy nodded before looking straight at Daniel and taking a hesitant step closer. Daniel's heartbeat quickened, each second stretching longer than it should, his mind racing through possibilities, all of them absurd, all of them impossible, and yet none of them enough to explain what he was seeing. He adjusted his suit jacket, tried to regain composure, trying to reassert control over a situation that made no sense. But control was slipping, and he could feel it. The boy was now only a few feet away, close enough for Daniel to see every detail. The reflection of the city lights in his eyes, the slight tremble in his lips, and then, in a voice so soft it barely rose above the noise of the street, the boy said it, "Dad." And just like that, the world Daniel Whitmore had spent decades building cracked wide open. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink, because if he did, it might make this real, and he wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Not when every instinct in his body was screaming that this was impossible, that he had no children, that his past was clean, controlled, accounted for. But standing in front of him were 4 undeniable contradictions to everything he believed about his own life. A cold breeze swept down the street, carrying with it the distant echo of sirens and the murmur of strangers. Yet Daniel heard none of it, because all he could focus on were those 4 faces, each one a reflection of himself, each one silently demanding an answer he didn't have. And for the first time in years, Daniel Whitmore, the man who always had answers, stood completely, utterly lost. Daniel did not answer, because answering would mean accepting something he was not ready to believe. And for a brief second, he convinced himself that if he stayed still enough, silent enough, this moment would dissolve like a strange illusion. But it did not. The boy remained there, looking up at him with quiet expectation, while the other 3 children slowly moved closer, forming a hesitant line just a few feet away, their eyes studying him with a mix of curiosity and something deeper, something that felt far too familiar. Daniel finally forced himself to inhale, his voice low and controlled as he said, "I think you are mistaken." Yet even as the words left his mouth, they sounded hollow, unconvincing even to himself. The smallest girl tightened her grip on her backpack straps and took a half step forward, her voice soft but certain as she said, "You look exactly like us." And that simple statement hit harder than any accusation ever could, because it was undeniable. Daniel straightened his posture, instinctively slipping back into the composed demeanor that had built his empire, scanning the surroundings, aware now of the passing glances from strangers who had begun to notice the unusual scene. And the last thing he needed was attention. Not here, not like this. He lowered his voice and said, "Where are your parents?" Hoping for a logical explanation, a simple answer that would restore order. But instead of responding, The children exchanged quick looks with one another, as if silently deciding what to say next, and that hesitation only deepened the unease settling in his chest. Then the oldest boy spoke again, this time more carefully. "Our mom told us we would recognize you if we ever saw you," and Daniel felt the ground beneath him shift once more, because that meant this was not an accident, not a coincidence. This was something planned, something known. Before he could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps approached, sharp and urgent against the pavement, and a woman's voice called out, "Kids," firm but controlled, carrying a tone that immediately changed the atmosphere. The children turned almost instantly, relief flashing across their faces as a woman stepped into view, her presence commanding despite her simple appearance. And the moment her eyes met Daniel's, everything froze again, but this time it was different, heavier, layered with recognition and something unspoken. Clara. Bennett had not expected to see him again. Not here, not like this. And for a fraction of a second, the careful wall she had built over the years cracked, revealing a flash of shock before she quickly masked it. She moved protectively in front of the children, placing herself between them and Daniel. Her voice steady but edged with tension as she said, "Stay away from them." And Daniel felt a sharp jolt of disbelief. Because her face was not unfamiliar. Not entirely. There was something in the way she spoke, the way she looked at him, that stirred fragments of memory buried deep beneath years of success and distance. He narrowed his eyes slightly, searching her face, trying to place her. But before he could grasp the connection, she was already guiding the children back, her hand gently urging them to move, her body angled defensively as if shielding them from him. Daniel took a step forward without thinking, his composure slipping just enough for urgency to seep into his voice as he said, "Wait," but Clara did not stop immediately, and when she finally did, she did not turn fully toward him, only enough to glance back, her expression guarded, resolute, and filled with a quiet strength that made it clear she was not someone easily confronted. The city noise rushed back all at once, louder than before, but Daniel barely registered it, because in that moment, one realization settled heavily in his mind, heavier than anything else he had felt that day. This was not random. This was not a coincidence, and whatever truth stood behind those 4 children, it was something Clara Bennett had been hiding from him for years. Clara's grip tightened slightly on the youngest girl's shoulder as she guided the children toward the corner, her pace calm but deliberate, as if every step had been rehearsed for years. Yet Daniel could not let this moment slip away, not when every instinct inside him was demanding answers he had never needed before. He moved after them, closing the distance with long, controlled strides until he was just behind her, his voice lower now, but carrying a firm edge as he said, "Clara," and the sound of her name made her stop instantly, her shoulders stiffening for just a fraction of a second before she slowly turned to face him fully this time. There was no confusion in her eyes now, no hesitation, only recognition and a quiet resolve that told him she had known exactly who he was the moment she saw him. Daniel studied her carefully, the pieces beginning to fall into place. Fragments of memory resurfacing from years ago, late nights at the office, a capable assistant who rarely spoke. About her personal life, someone who had simply disappeared without explanation. And now here she was, standing in front of him with 4 children who looked like they had stepped out of his own reflection. "You worked for me," he said, more as a statement than a question, and Clara gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, her expression guarded as she replied, "A long time ago," her voice steady but carrying the weight of something unresolved. Daniel glanced briefly at the children, who were now clustered close behind her, watching every word, every movement, as if the outcome of this conversation mattered more than anything else in their world, and that realization pressed heavily on him, because he could no longer pretend this was a coincidence. "We need to talk," he said, his tone leaving little room for refusal, but Clara shook her head immediately, her response firm, "No, we do not," and began to turn away again. Daniel stepped forward, not aggressive but insistent, placing himself just enough in her path to make it clear he was not going to let this end. Here, you do not get to decide that, he said quietly, the calm authority he was known for returning to his voice. But this time it was different, threaded with something more personal, more urgent. Clara met his gaze without backing down, her eyes sharp. "I have been deciding that for years," she replied, and that single sentence landed harder than anything else she could have said because it implied time, distance, and choices made without him. The air between them grew tense, not loud or chaotic, but heavy with everything unspoken. And for a moment neither of them moved, neither willing to yield. Then one of the boys tugged gently at Clara's sleeve and whispered, "Mom," the word soft but enough to shift everything again, because hearing it spoken so naturally, so undeniably, erased the last thin layer of doubt Daniel had been holding on to. His gaze dropped to the children, really seeing them now. Not just their faces, but the way they stood, the way they watched him, the subtle familiarity in their expressions, and a realization began to settle in, slow but unstoppable, that whatever truth Clara was hiding, it was not something small, not something simple. It was something that had shaped years of their lives without him even knowing. Daniel exhaled slowly, his voice quieter now, but more intense than before as he said, "If you walk away right now, this does not end. I will find out." And Clara's expression flickered, just for a second, a crack in her composure that revealed the weight of his words, because she knew he meant it. She knew the kind of man he was, the resources he had, the persistence he could bring to uncovering the truth. She looked back at him fully, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of defiance and something else, something that almost resembled hesitation. And in that moment, it became clear to both of them that whatever had been hidden for years was no longer going to stay buried. Clara held his gaze for a few seconds longer, as if weighing something far heavier than the moment itself. Then without another word, she turned and guided the children across the street, her pace quickening just enough to signal that the conversation was over, at least for now. But Daniel did not follow this time. Instead, he stood still, watching as they disappeared into the flow of the city, his mind already shifting from shock to strategy. Because if there was one thing Daniel Whitmore understood better than anything else, it was how to find answers when they were being deliberately hidden. Within minutes, he was back inside his black sedan, the door closing with a soft, controlled click that contrasted sharply with the storm building inside him. And as the driver pulled away from the curb, Daniel loosened his tie slightly, his eyes fixed on nothing as he replayed every second of the encounter, every word Clara had said, every look the children had given him, searching for patterns, for clues, for anything that could ground this situation in logic. By the time the car stopped in front of his office tower, the decision had already been made. He walked through the lobby with his usual composed presence, nodding briefly at familiar faces. But those who knew him well could sense something different in his energy, something sharper, more focused. And the moment he stepped into his private office, he closed the door and reached for his phone. "I need a full background report," he said without preamble when the line connected, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable urgency. "Clara Bennett, current address, employment, financial records, everything, and I want it fast." There was a brief pause on the other end, not of hesitation, but of understanding, because requests like this from Daniel Whitmore were never casual. Ended the call and set the phone down, exhaling slowly as he moved toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, the skyline stretching endlessly before him, a symbol of the empire he had built, an empire that suddenly felt less certain than it ever had before. Hours passed, but for Daniel, time moved differently now, each minute stretching under the weight of unanswered questions. And when the call finally came back, he answered immediately. "She lives in Queens," the voice reported. "Small apartment, no partner listed, works part-time at a local bookstore, income is modest, nothing unusual except." The voice paused slightly, and Daniel's focus sharpened. "Except what?" he asked, his tone steady. "Except she has 4 children, all listed under her name, no father on any of the records." And there it was, the confirmation he had not been ready to hear, but could no longer deny. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the information, letting it settle into place, because this was no longer speculation, no longer a strange coincidence on a busy street. This was something real, something that had existed for years without his knowledge. "I want more," he said after a moment, his voice quieter now, but more intense. "School records, medical history, anything that connects them to me." Another pause, then a simple response. "Understood." And the line went dead. Daniel remained. Standing by the window, the city lights beginning to flicker on as evening settled in, casting reflections across the glass that made his own image look distant, almost unfamiliar. And for the first time in a long time, he questioned something fundamental. Not about business, not about success, but about his own past, because somewhere in the years he had carefully controlled, something had happened without him knowing, something that had grown, taken shape, and was now standing right in front of him in the form of 4 children who shared his face. And the more he thought about it, the more one question refused to let go. Not who they were, because deep down he already knew the answer to that, but why Clara had kept them hidden for so long, and what else she was still not telling him. The next morning arrived with a clarity that Daniel did not feel, because while the city moved forward as it always did, his world had shifted into something uncertain and unresolved. He sat in his office. A detailed report spread across his desk, each page filled with information about Clara Bennett and the 4 children who had unknowingly changed everything. And yet the more he read, the less settled he became. Their names were listed clearly now: Lucas, Mason, Lily, and Sophie. Ages aligning perfectly with a timeline he could not ignore. And as his eyes moved across their school records and medical files, a pattern emerged that made his chest tighten. Blood types, genetic markers, physical traits, all pointing in one direction. One conclusion he was not ready to fully accept. His phone buzzed again, and this time the voice on the other end did not hesitate. Preliminary DNA comparison based on available data suggests a 99% probability of paternal match. And for a moment, Daniel said nothing, because hearing it spoken out loud made it real. In a way that nothing else had. It was no longer suspicion, no longer theory. It was truth pressing against him from every side. He ended the call slowly, placing the phone down with controlled precision. But inside, something was unraveling, years of certainty collapsing under a single undeniable fact. He had children, 4 of them, and he had not known they existed. But before he could fully process that, a second detail from the report caught his attention, one that shifted everything again. The children's medical history included a recent note, a recommendation for further evaluation for one of them, Lily, something non-urgent, but requiring follow-up care, and what struck him was not the condition itself, but the fact that Clara had delayed the appointment, not once but twice, citing financial concerns. Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at that line longer than anything else, because it revealed something deeper than secrecy. It revealed struggle. And the idea that his children, his own flesh and blood, might have gone without something they needed because he was not there, because he did not know, sent a sharp wave of emotion through him that he could not easily contain. Without thinking further, he stood, grabbed his coat, and left the office, his usual schedule abandoned without a second thought as he gave a simple instruction to his driver. Queens, his voice firm, decisive. Because waiting was no longer an option. The car moved quickly through traffic. And with every mile, Daniel's thoughts grew heavier. Not just with questions, but with a growing sense of responsibility he had never carried before. And when they finally pulled up to the modest apartment building listed in the report, the contrast between his world and hers became impossible to ignore. He stepped out, looking up at the worn exterior, the narrow windows, the quiet street. And for the first time, the distance between their lives felt real, tangible, and difficult to reconcile. Inside, the hallway was simple, unpolished, nothing like the environments he was used to, but he did not hesitate as he made his way to her door and knocked, once, firm and controlled, and for a few seconds, there was only silence. Then footsteps approached, slow, cautious, and the door opened just enough for Clara to appear, her expression immediately shifting from surprise to tension the moment she saw him. Standing there. "You should not be here," she said quietly, but Daniel did not respond right away, because behind her he could hear faint voices. The children, their presence unmistakable even without seeing them. And that sound alone made everything else fade. He finally met her eyes and said, with a calm intensity that left no room for avoidance, "We are past that point." And Clara's grip tightened slightly on the door as she realized something had changed. Not just in the situation, but in him, because this was no longer a man asking questions. This was a man who had already found answers and was no longer willing to be kept outside the truth. Clara did not open the door any wider, as if the narrow space between them was the only thing holding her world together. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching under the weight of everything that had not been said for years, until Daniel finally broke it, his voice steady but carrying a depth that had not been there before. "I know," and those two words were enough to shift the air between them. Clara's expression faltered, just slightly, her eyes searching his face as if try to measure how much he truly understood. And when she did not respond, Daniel continued, his tone calm but precise. "Their names are Lucas, Mason, Lily, and Sophie." And this time the reaction was immediate, a flicker of shock she could not fully hide, because those names were not public, not something he should have been able to access so quickly. And in that instant, she realized how far he had already gone. "You had no right," she said quietly, but there was less anger in her voice than before, replaced instead by something closer to exhaustion, as if she had been preparing for this moment long before it arrived. Daniel met her gaze without hesitation. "I have every right," he replied, not raising his voice, not forcing his way inside, but standing there with a certainty that made it clear he was not leaving. Not this time. Behind her, the faint sound of movement grew louder, small footsteps approaching, and before Clara could stop it, the door opened just a little more. As Lily peeked out, her eyes immediately finding Daniel, a mixture of curiosity and recognition crossing her face, and for a second, everything else disappeared for him. The hallway, the tension, the past, all of it fading as he looked at her, because there was no denying it anymore. Not in the shape of her eyes, not in the way she held herself. She was his. Clara gently placed a hand on Lily's shoulder, pulling her back slightly, but the moment had already happened, and there was no undoing it. Daniel exhaled slowly, his voice softer now, but more intense than ever. "One of them needs medical attention," he said, and Clara froze, the words landing with a weight that changed everything again, because this was not just about identity anymore, not just about the past. This was about something immediate, something real. "It is being handled," she replied quickly, almost too quickly, and Daniel shook his head slightly. "No, it is being delayed," he said, his eyes not leaving hers, and the accuracy of his statement stripped away the last of her defenses. For a moment, she said nothing, her composure slipping. Just enough to reveal the pressure she had been carrying alone, the decisions, the sacrifices, the constant balancing of what was needed versus what was possible. The hallway felt smaller now, more confined, as if the truth itself was closing in on them. "You do not get to show up now and act like you care," Clara said finally, her voice steady but filled with restrained emotion, and Daniel did not interrupt her, did not argue immediately, because part of him understood the weight behind those words, even if he did not yet understand the full story. "I did not know," he said instead, and there was no defensiveness in his tone, only a simple, unfiltered truth. But Clara shook her head, her eyes glistening slightly as she replied, "You were not supposed to know," and that sentence hung between them, heavier than anything else she had said, because it revealed something deeper, something intentional. Something that suggested this was not just a secret kept out of fear, but a choice made. For a reason. Daniel took a small step closer, not crossing the threshold, but close enough that his voice lowered, more personal now. "Then tell me why." And for the first time since he had arrived, Clara hesitated in a way that felt different, not defensive, not resistant, but uncertain, as if the answer to that question was something she had protected for so long that saying it out loud might change everything. And as the children watched quietly from behind her, sensing the shift even if they did not fully understand it, one thing became undeniable. The truth was no longer just close, it was right there, waiting to be revealed, and neither of them could walk away from it anymore. Clara closed her eyes for a brief moment, as if the question Daniel had just asked was one she had rehearsed answering countless times in her mind, but had never truly been ready to say out loud. And when she opened them again, there was something different in her expression, something less guarded and more resolute, as though she had finally reached the point where holding the truth in was no longer possible. She stepped back slightly, not an invitation, but not a refusal either, and said, quietly, "You should not be standing in a hallway for this." And that was all Daniel needed, because it was the first time she had not pushed him away. He stepped inside slowly, aware of every detail, the modest furniture, the neatly arranged books, the small shoes lined up near the door, each sign of a life built carefully, deliberately without him. The children watched him with wide eyes, a mix of curiosity and uncertainty, and Daniel felt the weight of their presence more than anything else. In the room, Clara motioned for them gently, her voice softening as she said, "Go to your room for a few minutes." And though they hesitated, they listened, moving quietly down the short hallway, but not before Lily glanced back at Daniel one more time, as if trying to understand something she could not yet put into words. When the door to their room closed, the silence that followed was heavier than before, because now there were no distractions, no interruptions, just the truth waiting. Between them, Clara took a steady breath, her hands clasped lightly in front of her, as if grounding herself. And then she said it, not dramatically, not loudly, but with a quiet clarity that made every word land. "I was pregnant when I left." And Daniel felt the impact of that sentence immediately, not as shock this time, but as something deeper, something that reshaped everything he thought he knew about his own past. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked, his voice lower now, stripped of authority, stripped of control, and Clara let out a small, almost disbelieving breath before answering. "Because you made it clear you did not want anything that complicated your life." And Daniel frowned slightly, confusion cutting through the emotion. "I never said that," he replied, but Clara shook her head, her eyes meeting his with a painful honesty. "You did not have to," she said. "It was in every decision you made, every conversation, every time something personal came up and you chose work instead." And for a moment, Daniel had no response, because while he could argue the details, he could not deny the pattern. Clara continued, her voice steady but carrying years of quiet endurance. "And then there was that night," she said, and Daniel's expression shifted slightly, searching his memory. "What night?" he asked, and Clara hesitated, just for a second, before answering. "The night I tried to tell you." And now, it was Daniel's turn to pause, because that was something he did not remember, something that did not fit into the version of events he had always believed. "I came to your office," she continued, her voice softer now, but no less clear. "I waited for hours, and when you finally came out, you were not alone. You were with someone, and you told me you were leaving for a trip, that nothing could interrupt it." She looked at him steadily. "So I did not say anything," and the implications settled heavily in the room, because to Clara, that moment had been the answer she needed. The confirmation that there was no place for her, or for what she carried. Daniel's mind raced, trying to recall, trying to piece together a memory that felt incomplete, and then slowly, something surfaced, a business trip, a rushed departure, a colleague walking beside him, but no awareness of what Clara had been there to say, no understanding of what had been left unspoken. "I did not know," he said again, but this time it sounded different, less like a defense, and more like a realization, and Clara nodded slightly. "I know," she replied, "but that does not change what happened." And that was the truth neither of them could escape, because everything that followed, the years apart, the children growing up without him, all of it, had come from that single moment of missed understanding. Daniel looked toward the closed door down the hallway, where the quiet presence of four lives he had never known waited, and for the first time, the full weight of what he had lost, not by choice but by circumstance, settled in completely, leaving him with a question that felt heavier than anything before, not about the past, but about what came next, and whether it was already too late to become part of a life that had learned to exist. Without him, Daniel remained still for a long moment after Clara finished speaking. The silence between them no longer filled with tension, but with something heavier, something that neither of them could easily move past. And as he looked toward the hallway again, the reality of what those years had taken from him settled in with a clarity that was impossible to ignore. He had not just missed moments, he had missed entire lives. First words, first steps, birthdays, quiet nights, all the things that could never be recreated. And for a man who had built everything through control and precision, the realization that something so important had existed completely outside of his awareness was deeply unsettling. "I cannot change what happened," he said finally, his voice steady but quieter than before, stripped of the confidence that once defined him. "But I can change what happens next." And Clara watched him carefully, not dismissing his words, but not accepting them either, because for her this was not about promises. It was about years of reality that could not be undone by a single moment of understanding. "It is not that simple," she replied, her tone calm but firm. "They have a life, a routine, a sense of stability, and you showing up like this changes everything." And Daniel nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth in what she said, because he could see it now, not just in her words, but in the way the apartment was arranged, in the quiet order of their lives, in the small details that reflected care and consistency. Before he could respond, the soft sound of a door opening down the hallway drew both of their attention, and a moment later, Lucas stepped out, followed by the others, their curiosity clearly stronger than their patience. And this time, Clara did not stop them. They moved closer, slowly, forming a small group a few feet away, their eyes shifting between Daniel and their mother, trying to understand what this moment meant. Daniel felt something shift inside him as he looked at them. Not the sharp shock from before, but something deeper, something steadier, a connection that did not need explanation. And for the first time, he allowed himself to see them not as a mystery, not as a problem to solve, but as his children. Lily took a small step forward, her voice soft but direct as she asked, "Are you really our dad?" And the question hung in the air, simple yet carrying more weight than anything else that had been said, because it was no longer about the past. It was about what they believed, what they needed, what they deserved to know. Daniel did not rush to answer, not because he did not know the truth, but because he understood that this moment mattered, that whatever he said would shape how they saw him from this point forward. He knelt down slightly, bringing himself closer to their level, his voice calm and honest as he said, "Yes," and there was no hesitation in it, no uncertainty, just a clear acknowledgement of something he could no longer deny. The children exchanged quick glances, their reactions a mix of surprise and something else, something that looked almost like relief, as if a question they had carried quietly for a long time had finally been answered. Clara watched the exchange closely, her expression unreadable, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, a small release of tension that suggested she knew this moment had been inevitable. Daniel looked at each of them in turn, taking in their faces, their expressions, the small details that made them who they were. And as he did, a new realization settled in, not about what he had lost, but about what was still possible, because despite everything, despite the years apart, they were here, standing in front of him, and for the first time, the future did not feel like something he could control, but something he would have to earn, step by step, choice by choice, starting with a single undeniable truth that could no longer be ignored. The room remained quiet after Daniel's answer, but it was no longer the same kind of silence. It was not heavy, with tension or uncertainty. It was something softer, something fragile, like the beginning of something that could either grow or break, depending on what came next. Lucas stepped slightly forward, his expression more thoughtful than hesitant now, and asked, "So where have you been all this time?" And the question, simple as it sounded, carried a weight that Daniel felt immediately, because there was no easy answer. No explanation that could give back would have been lost. Daniel held his gaze, choosing honesty over comfort as he said, "I did not know you existed." And while the words were true, he did not hide behind them. He let the meaning settle, acknowledging not just the fact, but the impact of it, The children exchanged glances again, processing, measuring, trying to understand a reality that had just changed in a matter of minutes, while Clara remained still, watching closely, her eyes moving between Daniel and the children, as if trying to protect them from disappointment, while also allowing them space to form their own understanding. Sophie spoke next, her voice quiet but clear. Are you going to leave again? And that question shifted everything, because it was no longer about the past. It was about trust, about whether this moment was temporary or the beginning of something real. Daniel felt the weight of it settle in deeply, and for the first time, he did not respond as a businessman, not as someone used to making promises backed by certainty, but as someone who understood that words alone would not be enough. No, he said, his voice calm but firm. But I know that saying that is not enough. And Clara's expression changed slightly at that, because it was not the answer she expected. It was more honest, more aware. Daniel continued, I am not here to take over your lives, and I am not here to disrupt what you have built. He glanced briefly at Clara before looking back at the children. I am here because I should have been here a long time ago. And I want to earn the chance to be part of your lives now, if you will let me. And there was no pressure in his tone, no demand, only an offer that left the choice with them. The children looked toward Clara instinctively, and she held their gaze for a moment, seeing the questions in their eyes, the curiosity, the cautious hope, and something in her softened, not completely, not all at once, but enough to allow the moment to move forward. She exhaled slowly and said, This is not going to be easy, her voice steady but no longer closed off, and Daniel nodded. I know, he replied. And for once, he truly meant it without trying to solve it immediately. Lily stepped a little closer again, her small voice breaking the tension in the simplest way. Can you come back tomorrow? And that question, so ordinary and yet so important, seemed to anchor everything in reality, turning a life-changing revelation into something as simple as showing up. Daniel allowed a faint, genuine smile to appear, the first one not shaped by control or expectation, and he said, Yes, I can come back tomorrow. And as the children absorbed that, as Clara watched with cautious acceptance, the moment settled into something new, not a resolution, not a perfect ending, but a beginning that required patience, effort, and time. Daniel stood there a moment longer, taking in the scene, the life he had just stepped into, knowing that nothing ahead would be simple, that trust would not be given easily, that every step forward would have to be earned, but for the first time, that uncertainty did not feel like something to avoid. It felt like something worth facing, because this was no longer about what he had built. It was about what he had nearly lost without ever knowing, and now that he didn't know, walking away was no longer an option. A powerful emotional journey unfolds as a wealthy businessman unexpectedly encounters 4 children who look exactly like him, leading to a life-changing discovery that challenges everything he thought he knew about his past and his future. As the successful millionaire begins to uncover the truth, he is forced to confront a hidden chapter of his life involving a resilient single mother who has been raising their children alone, creating one of the most unforgettable, touching stories filled with mystery, emotional tension, and heartfelt revelations. This narrative explores themes of misconnections, responsibility, and second chances, as the determined businessman seeks to understand why the devoted mother kept such a life-altering secret and what it truly means to become part of a family he never knew existed. Through moments of quiet confrontation and powerful emotional breakthroughs, this story delivers deeply touching stories that resonate with anyone who believes in redemption and the possibility of rebuilding what was once lost. As the children begin to form their own understanding of the truth, the story unfolds with authenticity and emotional depth, making it one of those touching stories that stay with you long after it ends. The contrast between wealth and simplicity, absence and presence, creates a compelling dynamic that drives the narrative forward while highlighting the strength of a mother's choices and the transformation of a man who must learn to earn his place not through power, but through patience and sincerity. This is one of those touching stories that captures the essence of family, forgiveness, and the courage to face the consequences of the past while building a better future. As each moment builds upon the last, the emotional stakes rise, delivering touching stories that are both relatable and unforgettable, ultimately reminding us that sometimes the most important connections in life are the ones we never saw coming. Character 1. 39-year-old white American male millionaire. Sharp facial features, confident expression, wearing tailored dark suit and white dress shirt, front-facing portrait, realistic lighting, urban background, high detail skin texture, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration, cinematic realism style. Character 2. 34-year-old white American woman, natural beauty, soft yet resilient facial features, minimal makeup, light brown hair tied loosely, wearing simple casual blouse and jeans. Front-facing portrait, realistic lighting, emotional expression, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration.